SEP FanFic Readings presents My True Love Gave to Me by Notebook and Ink. Chapter 10. I Saw Mommy Kissing Merlin. December 2004. Hermione remained in the hospital for almost a full week more, but was moved out of the critical care wing a few days after she woke up. After being moved, she had no shortage of visitors, including old classmates, colleagues from the Scamander Foundation, and most of the Weasley clan. Many were quite shocked at Draco's presence by her side, but eager to overlook it if they could hear the details of Hermione's ordeal, and how she'd come out the other side of it. Much to Draco's surprise, even Daphne and Theo stopped by one day, but as the trio chatted in front of him, his apprehension faded. Of all of his friends, he should have guessed that those two would be the ones to become fast friends with Hermione Granger. "Thank you for coming by, both of you," Draco said graciously as he walked his friends out of the wing. He knew it was likely that he wouldn't be able to retain all of his friendships when his time with Hermione became public knowledge, so it meant a lot that at least some of his friends were willing to accept what he had with her, especially Daphne. She was the closest thing he had to a sister. "Of course," Daphne smiled and put a gentle hand on his upper arm. "She's lovely, Draco, and I'm so glad the two of you have been able to put the past behind you to find each other. You both deserve happiness, and you seem to bring it out in each other. If either of you need anything, please don't hesitate to owl." Draco simply nodded his agreement and pulled her in for a hug. When they pulled apart, both of them glanced in Theo's direction. "You can stave that shit," he said, and held up his hands and took a step back. "But I'll double down on what Daph said. Don't hesitate." After the first day, Draco was drained from spending the entire time amongst the crowds, especially when they were mostly comprised of former Gryffindors. Hermione must have been able to tell, because as soon as he re-entered her room, she pulled him aside. "You don't need to stay through all of this, you know." She took his hand and squeezed it. "I can't imagine listening to the conversations of Gryffindors as your ideal way to spend an afternoon." Her lips pulled into a cheeky smile that he couldn't help but return. "It isn't," he replied with a light laugh. "But I don't want you to end up left on your own." "My parents and Harry are just as glued to my side as you are," she reasoned, "so I'll make you a deal." "A deal, huh? What are your proposed terms, Granger?" "As long as you promise to come back and spend the nights with me, you can go and spend your days however you want as far away from annoying visitors, even if we both know you'll just go to work." "Deal," he said quickly, sealed with a kiss. It was the easiest promise he'd ever made in his entire life. So for the rest of the week, that was exactly how their days planned out. In the morning, Draco would wait for one of the other three hoverers to arrive and relieve him, kiss Hermione goodbye, then head home to freshen up, imbibe a pepper-up potion, and head to the apothecary. As soon as he stepped through the door on his first day back, Bart was practically vibrating with excitement. Apparently Draco's absence at the renewal meeting was noted, yet the committee decided to grant their request anyway. Upon that news, the two wizards got to work on setting plans for what new kind of tinctures, potions, and infusions they believed would go over best with their customers, and what ingredients those items might contain. It was a huge project they'd put off until the shop was lucrative, but now Draco was ready to do more than just scratch the surface of his new venture. It didn't hurt that it was a welcome distraction from the thoughts of how Hermione was faring in the hospital. Logically, he knew she was getting the best care, and under plenty of watchful eyes, but because they weren't his eyes, he couldn't help the small ripple that would spread in his stomach. Maybe a new kind of anxiety-reducing potion was something he could add to their growing list. Work kept Draco occupied until the shop closed for the day, at which point he would head out to pick up food to bring back to the hospital, so he and Hermione could have dinner together. Not wanting to stagnate, he chose a different restaurant every day, but the effort was all worth it when he would enter the room and see her face light up after another monotonous day of retelling her story to the next set of visitors. As the sun set through the window behind them, the pair would sit and eat while Draco would tell her all about what he and Bart had accomplished that day. Then, of course, Hermione would toss in her 2 cents on what ailment might be worth looking into curing, and what ingredients they should try over others because of potency or rarity. As she waxed poetic, Draco would sit in awe of her vast catalogue of knowledge, and the fact that there wasn't any task his witch couldn't accomplish if she set her brilliant and beautiful mind to it. It was simple. He loved her, and would do anything to keep her in his life for as long as she loved him too, even sleep in an ungodly small hospital bed. They'd settled in for the night, and Draco caught himself, more than once, having to rub his sore facial muscles. He couldn't remember having smiled so much since the years before Hogwarts, when he was still just a spoiled child. Now, as an adult, he loved having a partner on the same intellectual level as he was. It seemed like they never ran out of things to talk about, and even if they didn't always agree with the other's point of view, their conversations were more of a discourse than an argument or an outright fight. He knew eventually they would have their share of fights. They were both born too stubborn not to. But for now, he was content with the sort of bubble they seemed to float in. "I suppose I have to really look into getting a flat rental now," Hermione said as they laid tucked into each other on the small bed. It was her final night in hospital, and they were supposed to be releasing her in the morning. "I had been looking before I left, but I never got around to actually touring any." Draco's eyes shot up in surprise. "You were?" "Yeah," she chuckled. "I meant to tell you weeks ago. That morning we said goodbye, but Rolf kind of derailed that conversation." Draco sighed. He could curse Scamander for all the trouble he'd caused in his life in recent years. "Harry, of course, said I'm always welcome at Grimmauld Place, but Ginny said she's looked at a few flats I should buy. I told her that was a little more permanent than I was planning on." That really caught Draco's attention. "So, you still think you'll go back?" He looked down at her, disappointment and a little anger lacing his tone. This whole conversation was like emotional whiplash. "I don't know for sure." She looked up at him with her amber eyes, and his anger melted a little. "I have to get the all clear from the healers first, and it all depends on what happens with the case. Merlin knows when it will go through all of the committees and red tape." Hermione wasn't wrong. The healers were hopeful, but she still had quite a bit of recovery left. She could barely walk across the room without getting winded, let alone chase after poachers in some far-flung corner of the world. And when Scamander had visited a few days prior, he'd updated her on the status of their project. It didn't look good. Multiple international committees had been called to look over the details of the planned operation, what went wrong, the damage that had been done, the exposure level, and if it was worth going back in immediately, if at all. "Well, I can save you the trouble of flat hunting. Move in with me." "What?" She shifted to sit up and look at him, an astonished look plastered on her features. "What?" He smirked and leisurely stretched his arms out, then settled them behind his head. "Did you seriously just ask me to move in with you?" "I mean, if you don't want to be stuck in a lease, it's kind of ideal for you. Besides, we've spent far too much time apart for my liking already." She hung her head and shook it in disbelief, but then huffed a laugh and risked a glance back in his direction. "You were the one who pointed out that we haven't been on a first date, and now you want me to move in with you." Draco shrugged, and his face fell into mock seriousness. "So I've become a bit of a contrarian in my old age. What are you going to do about it, Granger?" He wasn't sure when it had happened, but he now seemed to only use her last name when teasing her. Hermione wound back to playfully smack him in the arm, but when her hand came forward, he gently caught her wrist and rolled slightly so she was fully on top of him, then pressed their bodies and lips even closer. Minutes later, when they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. "I don't want to spend any more time apart than is absolutely necessary," he spoke softly, and pushed her curls out of her face, "especially if you think you'll probably be leaving again, whenever that might be." Hermione went in for another kiss, and the longer she lingered, the more passion she began to put into it. Draco matched her kiss for kiss, until her body began to roll over him searching for friction, and her fingers began to wander down the band of his pajama bottoms. "Ah," he admonished, and gently pushed her back. "You know that's not allowed." I don't care what the healer said. I know my own body, and I feel better." She tried to press in for another kiss, but Draco quickly jerked his head to the side, her lips just barely brushing his cheek. "As much as I would love to ravish you, Hermione." He turned back to see her lips flipped into a pout, so he reached out to wipe his thumb across them, then dragged down her bottom lip. "It is not my aspiration in life to be known as the man who shagged the Golden Girl into a coma." To Hermione's annoyance, a small chuckle escaped her throat. "That's some confidence you've got there, Malfoy." A smirk played at the corner of his lips as he thought of a cheeky rebuttal, but it fell away quickly. "You're supposed to be released tomorrow," he said seriously. "Why would we want to risk keeping you here any longer?" She sighed heavily. "You're right. I do want to get out of here, so we shouldn't risk it." Hermione slipped off his chest and dejectedly nestled back into his side. Draco pressed one last kiss soft to the top of her head and stroked her arm soothingly. He knew that he wanted her too much to be as gentle as was necessary. It was better if they waited until she got the all clear, so when the time finally came to resume the sexual side of their relationship, he wouldn't have to be. The next morning, the healers performed one last extensive exam and gave Hermione clearance for release. Her bruising was completely gone, and damage to her internal organs was finally fully healed. She looked almost completely herself again. Still, Draco carried what little belongings she had, and the two of them took a Muggle cab through London to his townhome. She had decided to take him up on the offer of staying with him. His flat was closer to the hospital than the Potters', or her parents' home, which was fortuitous since her release was conditional on her return once a week for checkups and physical therapy, as well as no travels by apparition, flu, or portkey until given the all clear, and she had to use a cane, which she absolutely hated, but Draco had jazzed it up a little with a bit of magic to try to make her feel better about it. It was plain to Draco's eyes that the following months were hard on Hermione. Her lingering nerve damage from extensive exposure to the Cruciatus curse caused tremors that made her movements twitchy, her walking unsteady, and consumed a lot of her energy just to do simple things like eat or go to the bathroom. It was like her mind and her body were no longer working in unison. She couldn't trust herself not to drop something, or even perform simple spells correctly, which frustrated her the most. On top of everything, because of her head injury, she wasn't allowed to overdo the reading or watching television to help pass the time. After 2 weeks of working from home on his end, slammed doors and threatened hexes on hers, Draco decided he would bring Hermione to the apothecary with him. Her physical therapy was showing slow improvement, but of course for his little overachiever it wasn't fast enough. She needed a distraction, and work in the brewing room wasn't very strenuous. He made sure she had a nice comfy stool to sit on, and Bart took care of watching over her to make sure she didn't burn the place to the ground. The older wizard was ecstatic to have her in the shop, and by the end of the first day their conversations had led to a vast improvement on Hermione's mood. She was so excited to go back the next day, and after only a week, the pair had come up with 2 new potions and a tincture they thought might be ready to move out of the theoretical and into experimental brewing. A few weeks later, she was given the all-clear to flu, apparate, and portkey short distances, so Hermione had set up a meeting with Scamander at the Foundation offices. Since it was her first time going solo, Draco had offered to go with her, but she insisted he remain in the lane of being her boyfriend and stop mothering her. He simply held his hands up in surrender, accepted her kiss goodbye, and watched her go. The meeting must not have gone the way she'd expected, because she flew into Draco's office in the early evening in a frenzy. As the green flame settled behind, her hair flew around wildly while she stomped across the room to flop down into the open chair, across from his desk, mumbling to herself. "Everything okay?" Draco asked tentatively, looking up from the unrolled parchment on his desktop. Hermione blew out a large puff of air to try and rid her vision of an errant curl that had come loose in her frantic motions. The obstinate piece floated gently back down in her face, and she pouted slightly before slouching into the leather backrest. With a sigh, Draco set his quill down and got up to walk around his desk and lean against its ornately carved front panel. "What happened?" He crossed his arms. "The entire Asia project is being shut down," she informed him animatedly. "Even the parts that took place in the more remote regions, which were simply about researching population numbers. Apparently my capture and rescue caused too much Muggle attention, and after their inquiry, the International Confederation of Wizards decided they don't want to risk any further exposure, which means that Slimeball we were trying to apprehend gets to continue to capture, torture, and slaughter innocent beasts with no consequences." In her raving, she ended up on the edge of her seat, so Draco knelt down in front of her to lightly rub the muscles of her calves to ease some of her tension. She'd been doing great in her recovery, but when she was this upset, he knew she'd have a flare-up. Clearly, she was frustrated that she couldn't return to continue what she'd started. He knew she hated to leave things unfinished, but inside, Draco was relishing in his own small victory. "You were gone for a while. Did you two talk about anything else?" he asked, and looked up into her eyes. They were filled with hesitation, and the small victory he was basking in was quickly snatched away. Hermione took a deep breath and spoke softly. "Rolf said that even though the Asia project is scrapped, as soon as I can get the all clear for my healers, I can go back into the field at any outpost of my choosing." Draco's hands fell away from her legs to his sides. and it felt like someone had vanished the floor beneath him. Over the last few months, falling into a blissful domestic routine with Hermione had been effortless. They woke up in each other's arms, then got ready for the day, each going about their normal routine somehow without crossover and arguments over who needed the toilet or the shower first. Then Draco would start the coffee for her and tea for him, knowing exactly how each took their preferred beverage, while Hermione made the food. They'd go to work together and discuss all things related to potioneering with Bart before breaking for lunch. They developed a daily restaurant rotation without even having a single conversation about it. Then, after lunch, they would research in his office together, never fighting over who had what text, or the good quill. For dinner, they would either make something at home, or visit the Potters, the Grangers, and occasionally even Theo, before falling back into each other's arms to sleep for the night. Life with Hermione was easy. Draco loved it, and could see it at the tip of his fingers for the future. Now it was being snatched away from him by her God's-forsaken job before he had the chance to fully grab onto it. Draco wasn't sure he could be trusted not to Avada Rolf's commander should he cross his path in the next few days. "What did you tell him?" he asked quietly, his gaze having shifted to the floor. "I told him I would think about it." She tried to reach for him, but he moved to stand too quickly and took a few paces across the room, needing space from her and the decisions she still seemed to make alone. The next week's routine was thrown completely out of balance. Draco slept in one of the guest rooms, and they hardly saw each other until they both arrived downstairs for breakfast, which was to be eaten in tense silence. Draco's calendar was filled with meetings he'd been putting off, so he wasn't around the apothecary much. But when he was constantly agitated that Hermione had used the last roll of parchment or waylaid his favorite quill. He didn't go with her to dinners at the Potters or her parents', and on Friday night he ended up at Theo's for some drinks with his oldest friend. He'd come home late and found Hermione asleep on the couch in front of the fireplace with the book having dropped out of her hand onto the floor. Even though he was still upset with her, he would gently pick her up and carry her upstairs to his bedroom to tuck her in before retreating to the guest room. On Saturday morning, Hermione had her final checkup and physical therapy appointment, while Draco nursed a pretty nasty hangover. He laid on the sofa in his home office, the thick curtains drawn to block out the afternoon light, when a series of soft taps rapped on the door before it creaked open. "Hey," came the familiar voice he'd barely heard in a week. "I had my last appointment today." "Mm-hmm," he hummed in response, but didn't get up. He could hear her footsteps getting closer. "Don't you want to know how it went?" Draco pressed his thumb and pointer finger into his eyelids just at the bridge of his nose and sucked in a sharp breath. "Mm-hmm," he breathed out, then sat up, his head spinning. He put his elbow on his knees and hung his head. With his long legs now off the couch, there was enough room for her to sit down beside him and rub his back. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. "It went great. I know you probably don't want to hear this, but they gave me the all-clear." He turned his head to her. "Why wouldn't I want to hear that?" he asked, confused. "It's practically a miracle, and I'm ecstatic that you're better, Hermione. Really, I am. It's the worry that you're going to end up right back in the hospital, or worse, the ground, that I can't stomach." "I know that, and I'm sorry." "So, you are going to tell Scamander you'll head back out to the field. Where will you go this time? India? The South Pole? I bet there's some nice icicle-ridden beast down there who could use your help." "I don't know yet. I still haven't quite decided." She dropped her hand from his back. "Why? Why would you do this now, after we had such a good thing going?" "Because I love my job, Draco," she reasoned. "More than you love me," he whispered. "Don't do that." She stood up. "Please, I don't want to fight about this." A little shaky, Draco shot up to his feet as well. "Why shouldn't I fight? You won't. If I don't fight for what we have, it disappears, Hermione. Gone. Out the window." He threw his arms out. "All for a job that almost got you killed. Even though you could be just as great at anything else. Look at everything you've accomplished in the apothecary in only a few weeks. That's helping others too, you know. Just because they have the ability to pay for their needs doesn't make them any less important than your beasts." Draco could see the tears starting to form on the edges of Hermione's eyelids as she tried to avoid his gaze, and his anger quickly dissipated. He didn't want to make her cry, but he had a point to make. If he didn't fight for them, who would? "You're only one person, Hermione," he said softer. "As much as I know you want to be, you can't be everywhere at once." Then her head quickly snapped up, and her eyes met his, a sort of clarity in them, before she turned on her heel and walked out of the room. Had she made her choice? Was she really going to leave him? His brain throbbing, Draco slumped back down on the couch and put his head in his hands. If he got up off this couch and climbed the stairs to find that she'd taken all of her things and gone, he wasn't sure what he would do with himself. He'd lost track of the minutes, but after what felt like hours, Draco heard footsteps coming down the hall towards the office. They came in through the door and stood in front of him, but he barely had the strength to look up. "You are a genius," Hermione said as she kneeled down in front of him and took his hands in hers. "I honestly don't know why I didn't think of it before." The look of joy on her face made Draco desperately want to come up with some snarky comment about said genius, but, be it the hangover or the devastation of thinking she was never coming back, he was coming up short. "You're wrong," she smiled. "How can I be a genius and be wrong?" he asked, his brow rising in curiosity. She moved one hand up to his cheek and wiped a traitor's tear that had somehow escaped. "I can't be everywhere at once." "I know you're adept at brewing polyjuice, Hermione, but I don't think that's quite the same." She rolled her eyes and swiped her cheek with her thumb again. "If I stay here in London and personally train the new recruits for field assignments, that's the closest I will ever come. I just went and told Rolf. It's decided." Draco sat up straight, Hermione's hand falling to his knees. "So, you're staying? Are you sure that's what you really want?" "I might have to make the occasional trip out to check on things sometimes, but yes." She smiled wide. "I'm staying." She paused for a moment to gather her thoughts together, but Draco just waited patiently. "After the war, I chased after the next fight I could find," she continued. "Yes, it was a cause I really believed in, but I also did it because I missed the excitement of that kind of life. Living in tents, looking for beasts, and chasing bad guys felt familiar. It was what I wanted. But before everything went south on my last assignment, I was considering scaling back on work. I haven't been blind to the fact that in the past 5 years, I've missed so much of life around here. Weddings, babies being born, or even just simply hanging out in a pub on a Friday night with my friends. I knew I didn't want to be caged in, but while I was trying so hard to avoid it, I cut myself off completely, which wasn't exactly my intention. But it happened nonetheless. Since the very beginning of our time together, you've never made me feel like I had to choose one or the other, no matter how much you may have wanted me to." Draco shot to his feet and pulled him up with him. Then, in one fluid motion, he ducked under her arm and tossed her over his shoulder to begin carrying her through the house. "What are you doing?" she managed to get out through her shrieks and giggles. "We're going to France," Draco shouted as he started climbing the stairs. As soon as she'd been released from the hospital, he procured and stashed away an international port key in the hopes that when she got the all-clear for travel, they could take a months-long vacation together. "France? Draco, I can't go to France. I just told Rolf I'd be starting training the new recruits soon." "You can owl him when we get there," he smacked her arse. "Draco!" She scolded him and pushed aside his back with her hands. "Seriously, I just had months off. I can't go on vacation." "Recovering from a near-death experience is not a vacation, Granger." He gave her bum another light smack. 1 week. Just give me 1 week. The foundation will still be there when we get back, I promise." If he spoiled her the way he intended to, Draco had no doubt that he'd have to drag her back to England after the week was over. "There's no talking you out of this, is there?" she said as they walked down the hallway towards their bedroom. "Now you're catching on." He smirked and kicked open the door. "Oh, for Cersei's sake, fine." She gave in. Their time together in France passed like a dream Draco never wanted to wake up from. Mornings were lazy affairs spent in cool, crisp linen sheets. When the sun poked its way through the shutters, Draco would wake with Hermione's curls and maybe an arm or a leg draped across himself. As he would lean in to press a chaste kiss to the top of her head, he would get a whiff of her floral shampoo, and it would hit him stronger than any vial of emertentia. After the first few days, when they never made it downstairs, the staff had taken to sending their breakfast up on carts full of silver platters with cloches and heirloom tea sets. After they'd eaten, one of them would venture to the shower, but it didn't take long before they were joined by the other, and it took a turn from getting clean to being dirty. Lunch was served on the terrace, where the stately trees made a nice block for the afternoon sun, as well as a lovely backdrop, along with the old stone walls of the building itself. Not having any visitors in quite some time, the elves really put out all the stops when it came to the food. A buffet of breads, spreads, cheeses, meats, fish, and nuts all awaited them when they walked outside every day, and they ate until they couldn't spare another morsel's worth of room. The rest of the day was spent aimlessly wandering around the nearby town, where Draco got to show off his impeccable French, which he could tell was a bit of a turn-on for his witch. With a melting glace in one hand, the fingers of their other hand stayed entwined together, only parting when Hermione found yet another bookshop to pop into. Draco didn't mind. He could watch her wander around those cobblestones for hours, her hair tied up in a messy bun, loose tendrils flowing down to her sun-soaked olive shoulders, and the edges of her ivory eyelet sundress flouncing around as she joyously walked through the town square, taking in every sight and sound. Occasionally they would wander further down the road to the beach. It was lesser known to the tourists, so they only had to share with a few groups of locals who seemed happy enough to share with them. When they weren't building sandcastles or chasing each other in the surf, they sat on the beach chairs, side by side under an umbrella, each reading a book of their choosing from the little shop in town. His was a contemporary fiction novel, and hers a history of the area written by a local author who had lived there her entire life. More than once, Draco had to suppress his chuckle as the book dipped. Then finally Hermione gave in to the nap that had been coaxed on by the heat of the sun. Dinners were back at the chateau, and just like at lunch, they were presented with an overwhelming amount of food and drinks, though the occasion never lasted too long. Through all the wine of the evening and affection of the day, Draco and Hermione could barely keep their hands off each other. Shoes were kicked off and clothes abandoned as they hastily made their way back up to their bedroom for the evening's entertainment. On their third day in France, Hermione would wake to a note on the tea tray. "My love, I'm sorry I'm not there to kiss you awake, but I've had some family business come up and I need to take care of. Spend the day doing whatever you please, and I will see you for dinner. XX. D." As much as they loved spending time together, Draco knew that her independence was something Hermione highly valued, and she hadn't had but a moment of time to herself since her stint in the hospital. They'd spent enough time there for him to be certain she would be okay on her own, and he had plenty he needed to arrange for their evening anyway. When she'd finished eating breakfast and got out of the shower, a large box was waiting for her on the already made bed. Inside, amongst the tissue paper, was a beautiful new sundress in a mossy green color, a matching lingerie set, strappy brown leather sandals, and a floppy sun hat. Once dressed, Hermione explored the chateau inside and out. The library was impressive, but most of the books were in French, and she could not read them. She was more interested in the magical artifacts that sat under glass cloches or on pedestals with museum-quality labels. Lucius Malfoy was a lot of things, meticulous being one of them. Though she had yet to see it, she imagined the library and studies at Malfoy Manor were much the same. After a time, she ventured down to the kitchens and informed the elves that she would like them to pack her lunch picnic-style so she could go enjoy the warm sunny day out in the meadow. As she lay on a blanket, her skin soaking up the sun, she couldn't help but relax completely. As the breeze swept over her, sending tendrils of hair floating about, she thought back to the last time she truly felt complete relaxation. Her mind was always working on something or other. It had to have been long before the war. She munched on her lunch as she enjoyed the midday sun, and as it started to slip behind the cypress trees, she made her way back into the house. "Another box arrived for you, miss. We've put it upstairs in your room." One of the elves smiled, then went back to their work. Hermione nodded, and then went upstairs and found the box on the freshly made bed. Once again she lifted the lid of the large white box, and opened up the tissue paper. Inside sat a calf-length velvet emerald green dress with a high neckline and 3/4 sleeves. Hermione ran her fingers along the luxurious material before skirting across the thin belt of diamonds that circled the waist. She'd never been one to put stock in material things, but she couldn't help the smile that pulled to her lips as she took in the extravagant gift from the man she loved. A look down at her watch threw her into a slight panic. She'd spent more time outside than she meant to, and would have to make quick work of getting ready. She took a quick shower to rinse off the sweat of the day, then got to work drying and taming her wild mane. Every updo she tried she hated, so eventually she settled for gathering her long flowing curls to one side and charming them to stay put before starting on her makeup. Once she was satisfied with a simple look, she left the ensuite and padded into the bedroom to slip into her dress. The material felt buttery soft on her skin, and Hermione knew she'd be a little sad when it was time to take it off again. With a wave of her wand, the zipper rose up her back, and she sat down on the duvet to take the chunky black heels out of the box as well. One last look in the floor-length mirror, and Hermione hardly recognized herself. Ever since she left the hospital, she'd been avoiding them, because she didn't like the thin, sallow, weak-looking woman that stared back at her. But now it was the image of a woman with fuller cheeks, bright eyes, and glowing skin. She didn't think she'd ever look this good, and in her heart it wasn't just because of the makeup and expensive dress. She was happy, and it definitely showed. Her smile stayed plastered on her face as she left the bedroom and made her way down the hall to the top of the stairs. When she looked down and saw Draco waiting for her at the bottom, it widened. "Hello, you," she greeted as she started down the stairs. Draco turned and his features lit up as his eyes raked up and down her lithe form. "You look stunning," he smiled back. "Thank you," she said, then stopped 2 steps from the bottom so they could be face to face. "Some gentleman caller left this outrageously hideous outfit for me, but I thought I should at least humor him and wear it at least this once." She wrinkled her nose at him. Draco placed his hand over his heart in mock offense. "Such a sharp tongue you have, Miss Granger." He was wearing one of his finer, more fitted black suits with a pressed white shirt and black tie. Hermione couldn't help but raise her arms to run her fingers over his chest. They itched to make their way to his hair, but it was pushed back, not a strand out of place, and she knew he had it exactly how he liked it, so she would just have to wait until later. "The dress is amazing," she smiled. "Thank you for buying it for me." As her fingers grazed his lapels, she leaned in and pressed a languid kiss to his lips. "You're welcome. I do have one more gift for you, though." Draco reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black box and held it out for her. Hermione's eyebrows shot up and she hesitated as she reached out to grab it. Draco chuckled. "Just take it." She finally complied and took a deep breath before opening it up. A small wave of relief washed over her when it wasn't a ring. She loved him, but she wasn't sure she was ready for that step just yet. Inside sat a pair of earrings with square-cut emeralds haloed by smaller diamonds. "Oh, Draco," she gasped. "They're gorgeous, but I really can't accept them. It's too much." He placed his hand on her waist and gave her a gentle squeeze. "No, it's exactly enough. They complete your outfit. Besides, it's my birthday, and I like my presents in pretty wrapping." She looked down and had the wolfish grin on his face, and the look in his eyes that made her go weak in the knees. "Your birthday?" Her features screwed up with worry. "No, it's—" She trailed off, trying to remember the last time she looked at a calendar, and mentally calculated what the date should be. Draco just watched her and laughed. "It's today." "Well, bollocks!" She huffed and looked rather disappointed. "I had a whole plan. This is your fault." "My fault?" "Yes, you whisked me away to a foreign country and coaxed me into relaxation with books and ice cream and sex." "I'm so sorry," he said sarcastically. Then he reached down and took both her hands in his. "Tell you what, next year we'll do your plan, and you can try to outdo what I have planned for this year." "Is that a challenge, Draco Malfoy?" "If you want to take it that way," he smirked. Hermione leaned in and pressed her foreheads together. "You're on." With a quick kiss to her lips, Draco led her by the hand out of the chateau and apparated them to their next destination. The lapping of water against the dock gave away their location at the marina. When the pull of apparition faded, and Hermione opened her eyes, she was standing in front of a 70-foot sailing yacht. "You bought a boat?" "No," Draco smiled. Hermione's face fell into disbelief. "Technically, we already had a boat, but it was getting old and decrepit from never being used. I just upgraded." "Of course you did," she rolled her eyes. "So this is what you've been doing all day?" "Not all day." He led her across the gangplank onto the vessel and towards the back. Hermione already felt unsteady in heels, and the subtle rock of the boat wasn't helping. So she tightened her grip on his hand. "What else have you been up to, then?" "You'll see," he said as he deposited her onto the bench seat. "Biddy," Draco called out. A house elf appeared with a crack that made Hermione jump a little. "Yes, Master Draco," he replied. "We're ready to cast off." "Of course, sir." The house elf snapped his fingers, and Hermione watched as the ropes keeping them tied to the dock lifted and wound themselves into neat piles on the deck before the motor turned over. Draco, who had made his way over to the wheel, began to steer them away and then out into the bay. Once he was satisfied with their location, he nodded to Biddy, who again snapped his fingers, and a large anchor dropped to keep them still. With another quick click, a table appeared in the middle of the boat. A white cloth appeared above and gently floated down to cover it. Then place settings appeared, as well as crystal wine and water glasses. Suddenly, Draco stood in front of her, a mischievous smile on his face, and his hand outstretched for her to take. As they walked to the table hand in hand, Hermione took in their surroundings. The sun had made its final descent beyond the horizon, and windows from the houses on darkened cliffs were beginning to light for the evening. Draco led Hermione to her chair and pulled it out for her to sit down, and she trailed a hand down his arm as she did so. Once she was seated and moved closer to the table, Biddy appeared before them. "Ready to be served, Master Malfoy?" "Yes, Biddy, thank you," he nodded. "Then you may return to the house." Draco took a seat across from Hermione. Then, with a nod and sharp snap of his fingers, the elf disappeared into smoke. A napkin for each of them floated down onto their laps. Their glasses filled with red wine, and a cart with multiple covered dishes appeared on their tableside. Draco waved his hand, and the silver covers disappeared off of 2 of the plates. Then they floated over to their chargers. Hermione grabbed her glass of wine and took a drink as she surveyed their meal. It was fit for a 5-star restaurant. "So this is what you've been doing all day," she smiled. Draco chuckled. "Not the cooking, but the planning, certainly." Hermione's brow raised in slight confusion. "Then why buy me a whole outfit for earlier today as well, if you knew you weren't going to be around to see it?" He chuckled. "Just because I'm not going to see it doesn't mean that I won't buy you something nice. Besides, I know you're not the type to wear something once and toss it aside. I'm sure I'll see you in it eventually. Perhaps the next time we come to France." "Is there going to be a next time? I haven't dreadfully worn out my welcome by dragging you into every bookshop in town?" "Not yet." His eyes smiled. Their dinner passed in quiet conversation about various topics the way it always seemed to, and they soon had gone through almost 3 bottles of wine and had come to dessert. A decadent-looking chocolate layer cake sat on a tray, and a singular birthday candle was lit when Draco waved away the last silver dome. As he plated it, Hermione felt the urge to sing, but fought it off as she knew that was something no one needed to hear. Instead, she held up her wand, which shot confetti all around them when he blew out the candle, and she couldn't help return the wide smile he gave her. "I didn't know you could sail," she said later as their bodies were pressed together, and they slowly swayed in circles around the deck to some old melancholy music. The lights from the houses on the shore had started to go out one by one, as many families turned in for the night. The water around them was glassy and calm, billions of stars reflected into an endless sphere of the night sky. The summer air was warm, even at the late hour, and Draco had shrugged off his jacket after dinner. "A little," Draco answered and looked down into her face, her cheeks rosy from all the wine. "Biddy does most of the work. He knows a lot more about it than I do, because he used to sail all the time with my grandfather. He loves it, and it's definitely something I'd like to learn more about someday. Put this boat to good use, and not just have it collect dust." "If I've learned anything about you in the last few years, it's that you won't be stopped once you've put your mind to something," she said as she laid her head against his chest. "I think you're confusing me with yourself." "I'm really not. Look at everything you've accomplished in the last few years, Draco. You helped re-establish your family's reputation for the better, and got the finances back in order. You started a successful business venture and have been taking care of not only me, but yourself and your mother as well. After the war, you were very easily could just let things be and lived off what fortune your family had left, never re-entering or contributing to society at all. You chose to take risks and make your life what you wanted it to be, no matter what others think. If that's not determination, I don't really know what is." He didn't respond other than give her a lengthy squeeze and kiss to the crown of her curls, and she couldn't help but nuzzle into him a little bit more. "This whole trip has been amazing, Draco. Thank you for sharing it with me." After a hefty sigh, Draco pulled the hand that was entwined with his up to his mouth and pressed a slow kiss between her knuckles. "There's no one else in the world I would rather have here, Hermione." The sincerity in his eyes tugged on her heart and tightened her throat. She knew he deeply cared for her. The last few months were evidence of that. He hadn't needed to go to all this trouble, but it was still a nice gesture nonetheless. It wasn't often that she was lost for words, but it was a situation she was currently finding herself in. "I know the last few months have been hard on you," he continued, "and even though it's wrong of me to be happy you were injured, I can honestly say that I've loved having you stay with me." Draco looked away from her sheepishly from his admission. "Now that you're fully healed, I'm sure you'll probably want to be looking for your own place, but I was kind of hoping if I spoiled you enough while we were here, maybe I could convince you that continuing to live with me might not be so bad." Hermione pulled back just enough to turn her face up to his and look into his eyes. The worry she could see reflecting back in them nearly broke her heart, and she immediately felt the need to soothe and reassure him. "It hadn't even crossed my mind to find someplace else," she admitted as she reached up to palm his cheek. "I was nervous about it in the beginning, but that was mostly because I've had to get used to city living again, and I don't want to move anywhere else. I love living with you." She watched as the hesitation melted away from his features as her comforting words washed through him, and before she knew it, he had crashed his lips into hers and they were falling into the bed once again. "So is this our first official date, then?" she asked drowsily against his chest. "Was that not obvious?" he chuckled. "I told you you'd know when I was courting you." "So we are officially a couple, then?" "If you want to be." He absent-mindedly brushed his thumb back and forth across the back of her hand. "Oh, that wasn't a question," she stated with a smirk on her lips. Draco's chest rose and fell with this chuckle, and he leaned in to press a kiss to her hand. "Happy birthday, Draco," as she sank deeper into her sleepy state. "Thank you, my love. I hope that from now on they'll all be as great as this one." Now that both Draco and Hermione were more secure in their status as an official couple, when they returned home from France, life seemed to flow even more effortlessly. Hermione made peace with her new role as the Scamander Foundation, and found that she quite enjoyed teaching. She felt a far greater sense of accomplishment knowing that she was helping countless more magical beasts by training her fellow witches and wizards than simply running around the world on her own. Draco jumped right back into his work with Bart, and pretty soon they had a handful of new potions and lines of customers out the door. He'd even had to hire a few more shop workers to help Trudy with the workload. Once a month, when Hermione would have to leave town to check on the outpost, Draco would use this time to get together with his own group of friends. Theo was perpetually around, so they mostly planned around Blaise and Pansy's travels. Then, when Daphne's divorce was finalized, she moved back to London and would join them as well. It was great to have all of his friends together in one place more than once or twice a year. Other weekends were either spent going to a pub with the Potters, a dinner at Malfoy Manor with his mother, that Theo often found reason to crash, or the occasional dinner at the Granger's house. In September, Draco received an unexpected visitor to his office, one Ginevra Potter. She asked Draco if he had made any plans for Hermione's birthday. When he told her that he was only planning on a small thing between the two of them, she frowned deeply. She reminded him that this was going to be the first birthday Hermione had spent in England in a long time. Draco conceded that Ginny was right, and it was an occasion that should be marked with more pomp and circumstance. By the end of his lunch break, his own plans had been set aside for a large surprise party at Draco's flat. He was almost certain the red-headed witch had used the Imperius curse on him, for he wasn't sure how he had gotten him to agree to host. But since it was for Hermione, he caved. It was easier than he thought it would be to keep the secret, mostly because she was rather distracted with work that week, and Draco had never been so thankful for her job. The Foundation had gotten a tip about rare birds being smuggled out of Africa, so she was working hard to refresh the team they were sending, as well as training a few new members. Her birthday fell on a Sunday, so when the Saturday before finally came around, Draco woke her with a breakfast tray and another large white garment box containing an outfit for the day. Since she hadn't protested to the gesture when they were in France, he figured that he would just continue the tradition until she told him to stop. Together they spent the day going to all her favorite places in Muggle London, even stopping at the music shop they'd run into after all that time ago, and having lunch at their cafe. When evening descended, he asked whether she was up for having dinner out or if she wanted to just head home. As predicted, the long day of walking around town had tired her enough that she was ready to head back. They headed to the nearest apparition point, and when the world righted itself, they were standing on the stoop in front of his flat. When she reached for the door handle, he stopped her, and she looked up at him with a puzzled expression. Draco leaned down, placed a gentle kiss on her lips, and muttered, "I'm sorry about this," while his free hand slipped her wand out of her pocket. With his other hand on the door handle, he clicked the knob and pushed it open. He ushered her into the dark foyer, and when the door closed behind him, the light suddenly blazed on, and about 40 people all yelled, "Surprise!" Instinctually, she reached for her wand, but when it wasn't there, Draco shot him a look of daggers. "I said I was sorry." He held up his hands in defense. After everyone had left for the evening, and they were tucked into bed, Draco had one last surprise. He disentangled himself from her, rolled over onto his side, and reached onto his bedside table. "What are you doing?" she asked, indignant that he'd taken away his body heat. "I didn't want to forget this," he said as he rolled back over with a long black velvet box in his hands. "Draco," she sighed, "the day was perfect. You really didn't have to get me anything." She protested, and she took the box from him and hesitantly opened it. "I did," he smiled. "Your earrings were lonely." Inside the box was an emerald necklace on a simple silver chain, which matched the earrings he had given to her on his birthday. Simple enough to wear every day, but still large enough for her to consider extravagant. Hermione ran her fingers along the chain, then across the jewelry, before shutting the box and rolling over onto Draco's chest to plant a searingly passionate kiss to his lips. After Hermione's birthday, the next big event in their lives was the annual Malfoy Christmas party. Pansy had already been planning since the summer, but it wasn't until the fall that Draco was getting weekly visits to his office to talk about soft and firm party budgets. The weeks leading up to the event seemed endless, but the actual day was over quicker than he would have liked. Now that he had his preferred witch on his arm, the night was far from tedious and boring. He would have spun her around that ballroom all night if she'd let him. The following weekend was Christmas, and since Draco had already promised his mother that he'd spend Christmas Day at the manor with her and Theo just as they always did, he spent Christmas Eve with Hermione at her parents' house. Christmas at the Grangers was nothing like Draco had ever experienced before. Their relatively small house wasn't pristinely decorated with fine, fragile ornamentations, expertly positioned in the most advantageous spots. It was almost haphazardly decorated with heirloom holiday bric-a-brac scattered about every room. They had one plain green tree, with colored lights strung between its branches, and handmade ornaments strewn about the branches and tinsel. 3 matching handmade stockings hung in a neat row from the fireplace mantel, with a newer, smaller one that had a paw print in the center hung over by the edge. It was cozy. It felt like a real home. As Draco sat quietly in a chair in the corner, David played a myriad of Muggle Christmas songs loudly on the piano in their sitting room, while Hermione belted out the lyrics, rather off-key, alongside him, and Susan finished preparing their dinner in the kitchen. After the first few songs, Hermione danced her way over towards him, and he couldn't help the wide grin that spread across his features. She grabbed his hand and tugged on his arm, but Draco wouldn't budge. "Oh, come on," she pleaded. "I know you know the words. Your iPod continues to be the more clever gift." "Not a chance, Granger." "Please," she pouted. Draco rolled his eyes, but finally gave in after a few more tugs. He held onto her hand as she led him back across the room. Together they all sang out a few more songs, until Susan summoned them to the dining room to eat. After a very traditional meal, the 4 of them gathered around the Christmas tree to open one present each. A Christmas Eve tradition, he was told. "Open the ones for me, then, since I won't be here with you in the morning," Draco said. Hermione nodded and grabbed the 2 impeccably wrapped gifts he'd brought in and put under the tree with the rest. David and Susan opened their gifts, which Hermione had helped him pick out, so he was sure they would enjoy them, and when they were finished she looked to him from her chair next to his. "Did you bring one for me?" she asked. "I don't see anything else under there." Draco swallowed hard and nodded. He'd been planning this for months and didn't want to mess it up now, but he didn't think he'd ever felt so nervous. "Come on, love. David got up from his chair and turned to hold his hand out to his wife. "You can help me bring the dessert in." Hermione watched as her parents left the room. Then she shifted her position to her chair to get more comfortable and wait for their return. When she turned back to Draco and smiled at him, all of his butterflies seemed to dissolve. "Hermione, my love," Draco started as he reached into his jacket pocket for the small box. 3 years ago, you walked into a music shop and back into my life. And from that moment on, I've known that I had never wanted you to walk out of it ever again." He popped the box open, and Hermione's hand flew up to cover her gaping mouth. "This ring was given to my great-grandmother by my great-grandfather. His family had arranged for him to marry someone else, as the woman he loved wasn't considered a suitable match. He went to great lengths to follow his heart anyway. Luckily, he was the sole heir, and so the family covered up the scandal, and together he and his wife lived their lives the way they chose and grow old together." Draco paused and took a small breath, hoping he was conveying his intentions correctly. "I've always felt this odd sort of connection to this ring, but I never understood why until about a year ago, when I asked my mother if I could have it." Hermione's eyes were swimming in building tears, and Draco looked down at the ring in his hand. "As the sole Malfoy heir, I'm supposed to use my mother's ring, the one that has been passed down through the family line for centuries, and presented to the woman my family has helped choose for me." He chanced to glance back up to the witch he loved with all his heart, and her tears had spilled over the red rims of her eyes and tracked down her cheeks. She made no attempt to wipe them away, so he reached for her hand and held it to his. "I've realized that I too am willing to go against my family's expectations to do what makes me happy, no matter what anyone says. I want to spend the rest of my life trying every day to make you as happy as you make me. And since you've so patiently let me get this whole speech out without interrupting once," he smirked, "and I'm positive you have plenty to say on the matter, I'd like to know your thoughts on it. Hermione Jean Granger, will you marry me?" The end. Just kidding, there's more. Epilogue. Summer 2005. Draco and Hermione return from their honeymoon to find a large pile of mail in the foyer of the townhouse. He steps around it and heads upstairs to unpack their bags, while Hermione picks it up and shifts through the giant stack while she paces the hall. About halfway through, she sees an envelope with the official seal of the Wizengamot waxed onto the opening. Having mindlessly passed the side table, and with her hands full, she fumbles but finally opens it. As she scans through the contents, the rest of the envelope slip out of her hands and cover the floor once more. "Hermione?" Draco says from the doorway. "What is it, love?" Her eyes flick to his face, and the shock plastered on her face pulls him across the foyer, like gravity, to stand in front of her and stroke his hands comfortingly on her upper arms. When she hands him the letter, her hands are slightly shaking. Draco keeps one hand on her while he reads the letter, and when he's finished, he doesn't say a word. His jaw simply sets into a hard line. "Your father has somehow procured an early release from Azkaban," she says. Draco let the letter fall away as he wrapped his wife in an all-encompassing hug, the type of embrace he hasn't used since the start of their relationship, when it felt like she'd be taken away from him at any moment. He'd taken for granted how easy it had been to court and marry the love of his life, since he'd only ever been dealing with the more sensible and romantic of his parents. He could only imagine what Lucius would have to say about his only son and heir marrying a Muggle-born behind his back, and Draco wasn't looking forward to finding out.